Hi, I'm Natalie. 3 months ago, I received a credit card statement that made my blood run cold. The balance read 47,818 15 precise folds that transformed the symbol of everything I'd fought for into Periv. The perny timing of Bamistings forks in Adelaide saying. Designer handbags from Cherry Creek Mall. A week-long vacation to Aspen. Electronics from Best Buy. Restaurant bills that cost more than my monthly rent. All on cards I'd never given to anyone. All signed with my name. All authorized by people who shared my DNA and thought that gave them the right to steal my future. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. But here's what they didn't know. I wasn't the naive, trusting daughter they thought I was. I was the granddaughter of a woman who survived the Great Depression by watching every penny, and the niece of a man who built an empire from nothing. They had taught me something my own parents never learned. Silence isn't weakness, it's strategy. And I was about to give them a masterclass in consequences. The morning everything started to unravel, I was sitting in my downtown Denver loft, watching the sunrise paint the Rocky Mountains in shades of gold and pink. Steam rose from my coffee mug as I opened my laptop to check my monthly budget spreadsheet. It was a ritual I'd maintained since college. Something Aunt Helen had taught me when I turned 18. Every dollar accounted for, every expense tracked, every financial goal mapped out with military precision. I lived simply but deliberate. My loft was small but mine, furnished with pieces I'd saved for and bought outright. No debt, no credit card balances, no financial stress keeping me awake at night. At 26, I was proud of the discipline I'd built. While my friends complained about money, I had 6 months of expenses saved and a growing investment portfolio. It wasn't glamorous, but it was secure. That morning should have been like any other. Check the budget, review investment accounts, plan the week ahead. Instead, when I logged into my credit card account to verify the zero balance I always maintained, the number on the screen made me physically sick. $47,892.15. My first thought was identity theft. Someone had stolen my information and gone on a shopping spree. But as I scrolled through the transactions, fighting nausea with each line item, the locations became sickeningly familiar. Nordstrom at Cherry Creek Mall, where my sister Vanessa always dragged me shopping. The Broadmoor Resort in Colorado Springs, where my parents had mentioned wanting to take an anniversary trip. Williams-Sonoma, where my mother Patricia spent hours browsing kitchen gadgets she never used. The timestamps told a story I didn't want to believe. Charges made while I was at work, while I was sleeping, while I was trusting the people who were supposed to protect me. The pattern became clear as I traced backwards through 3 months of statements I'd somehow missed. Small purchases at first, testing the water, a dinner here, a tank of gas there, then growing bolder. Shopping sprees, spa days, expensive electronics. But it was the charge from 2 days ago that broke something inside me. Tiffany & Co., $3,400. The date matched perfectly with my younger sister's Instagram post, showing off a new tennis bracelet, tagged with blessed and family first hashtag. The same sister who'd cried to me just last month about being broke, who'd asked to borrow $20 for gas money while wearing the bracelet I'd apparently bought her. I sat there for an hour, staring at the screen, my coffee growing cold. The apartment felt different somehow, like the walls had shifted when I wasn't looking. Everything I'd worked for, every sacrifice I'd made to build financial security, had been stripped away by the people who should have celebrated my success. My phone buzzed with a text from my mother. Sunday dinner at 6. Can't wait to see you, honey. Dad's grilling those steaks you love. The casual normalcy of it, sent while she was probably planning what to buy with my money next, made my stomach churn. I'd grown up in a family where money was always tight, or at least that's what they told me. We shopped at thrift stores, ate generic cereal, lived in a modest house in Lakewood where the heat was kept low in winter, and the air conditioning was a luxury we couldn't afford. My parents, Kenneth and Patricia Brooks, worked middle management jobs and complained constantly about bills, about not being able to afford vacations, about watching their friends live better lives. That's why I'd worked 3 jobs through college. That's why I'd chosen a practical major in accounting over my dreams of studying art. That's why I'd moved into the smallest apartment I could find and bought my clothes from discount stores. I thought I was being responsible, showing them that someone in our family could break the cycle of financial stress. When Uncle Tony died 2 years ago and left me his auto repair shop, my parents had been supportive, the business came with complications, an older building that needed work, equipment that should have been replaced years ago, and a customer base that was loyal but small. Most people my age would have sold it immediately, taken the cash and run. But Aunt Helen, Uncle Tony's widow, had pulled me aside at the funeral and pressed something into my hand. It was a key, old and worn smooth from years of use. "Your uncle wanted you to have the shop," she'd whispered. "But more than that, he wanted you to have what it could become. He saw something in you that reminds him of himself at your age. The discipline, the vision. Don't let anyone tell you what to do with it." I'd kept the shop, working nights and weekends to learn the business while maintaining my day job at a downtown accounting firm. It was exhausting, but slowly the repair shop began to turn a profit. Not huge amounts, but steady income that I reinvested into better equipment and small improvements. The extra money went straight into savings and investments, building the financial foundation I'd always dreamed of. My family had seemed proud of my success. They'd celebrated when I paid off my student loans early, cheered when I bought my loft, and asked detailed questions about my investment strategy. I thought their interest came from genuine care, maybe even a desire to learn better financial habits themselves. Now I understood they'd been cataloging my assets, calculating what they could access, planning their theft down to the smallest detail. The credit cards had been my one mistake, the single crack in my otherwise careful financial armor. When I'd started the auto shop, I'd needed to establish business credit quickly. Several cards with high limits, meant for large equipment purchases and emergency repairs. I'd kept them locked in my safe at home, never using them except for legitimate business expenses that I paid off immediately. Except someone had made copies. Someone had watched me open that safe, memorized the combination, and gained access to cards with my name but limits I'd earned through careful credit building and the shop's growing success. The same family members who'd trained me to be careful with money had been stealing it while teaching me the importance of trust. As I sat in my loft that morning, reviewing the devastating charges, I remembered something Aunt Helen had told me at Uncle Tony's funeral, after she'd pressed that key into my palm. We'd been standing in the parking lot of the funeral home, watching my parents load flowers into their car, when she'd turned to me with an expression I'd never seen before. "Your uncle loved your parents," she'd said quietly, "but he worried about you growing up in their house. Not because they're bad people, but because they've never learned the difference between wanting something and deserving it. He made me promise that if anything ever happened to him, I'd make sure you understood that difference." At the time I'd thought she was just processing grief, maybe being unfairly critical of my parents during an emotional moment. Now her words felt prophetic, like a warning I'd been too naive to understand. I closed my laptop and walked to the window, looking down at the busy Denver street. People hurried to work, grabbed coffee from sidewalk vendors, lived their normal Wednesday morning lives while mine fell apart in real time. The city looked the same, but everything had changed. The family I'd trusted, the people I'd worked so hard to make proud, had been systematically destroying my financial future, while pretending to celebrate my success. But as I stood there, something else started to build alongside the betrayal and anger. A cold, calculating calm that reminded me of Aunt Helen's steady voice, of Uncle Tony's patient way of solving problems. They thought they knew me, thought they understood what I was capable of. They saw a young woman who worked hard and trusted easily, someone who could be manipulated because she loved them. They had no idea that the same discipline that had built my savings account could be used to dismantle their scheme. They didn't know that the niece who'd inherited Uncle Tony's business sense had also inherited his strategic mind. Most importantly, they didn't realize that their careful daughter had been learning from the best teacher of all their own behavior. I'd been watching them my entire life, cataloging their patterns, understanding their motivations. I knew exactly how they thought, how they justified their actions, and how they'd react when cornered. They'd spent months planning their theft, but they'd also given me months of evidence, months of behavioral patterns, and months to understand the depth of their betrayal. The phone buzzed again. Another text from my mother. "Forgot to mention, we invited Marcus too. Family dinner like old time." My older brother Marcus, who'd been posting photos of his new gaming setup on social media, equipment that would have cost thousands of dollars on his retail salary, equipment that I'd apparently financed without knowing it. I picked up my phone and typed back, "Can't wait, see you at Then I deleted the message and typed something else. "Looking forward to it. I have some exciting news to share with everyone." That was true, I did have news to share, just not the kind they were expecting. I spent the rest of the morning at my kitchen table, spreading out 3 months of credit card statements like a prosecutor preparing for trial. Each charge told a story, each pattern revealed the careful planning behind their theft. They'd been smart about it, never taking so much at once that it would trigger fraud alerts, spreading purchases across different cards, timing charges to avoid obvious patterns, but they'd also been sloppy in ways they didn't realize. Every purchase location corresponded to their social media posts. Every charge amount matched items they'd suddenly acquired. Most damning of all, they'd used the cards during specific time windows when they knew I was busy, when I wouldn't be checking accounts or monitoring spending. It wasn't random theft. It was calculated, premeditated, and coordinated. They'd turned stealing from me into a family project, probably comparing notes, sharing strategies, celebrating their successful purchase. The image of them sitting around their dinner table, planning what to buy with my money next, made my hands shake with rage. But underneath the anger was something colder and more dangerous: determination. They'd taught me to be careful with money, to plan ahead, to think strategically about financial decisions. Now I was going to use those same skills against them. By noon I had a plan, not just for confronting them, but for protecting myself and ensuring they faced real consequences for what they'd done. They thought they knew their quiet, responsible daughter who always put family first. They were about to discover that responsibility and family loyalty worked both ways, and they'd violated both beyond repair. I made 3 phone calls that afternoon. The first was to my bank.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
Reporting the unauthorized charges and requesting immediate holds on all affected accounts. The second was to attorney I'd researched online, scheduling an emergency consultation for the next morning. The third was to Aunt Helen. "I need to ask you something," I said when she answered, my voice steadier than I'd expected. "When Uncle Tony left me the shop, did he say anything about my parents, about protecting the business from family?" There was a long pause, then Aunt Helen's voice came through the phone, careful but knowing. "What happened, honey?" I told her everything: the credit card charges, the pattern of theft, the months of systematic betrayal. When I finished, the silence stretched so long I thought the call had dropped. $47,000, she finally said, her voice tight with controlled anger. "Natalie, your uncle saw this coming. He made provisions." "What do you mean?" "The business documents, the ones you signed when you inherited the shop. There are clauses in there that protect you from exactly this kind of situation. Financial fraud by family members, unauthorized access to business accounts, everything." He insisted on them because he'd watched your parents' spending habits for years. He loved them, but he didn't trust them with money, especially not your money. For the first time that day, I felt something other than betrayal and anger. I felt protected, even from beyond the grave, by an uncle who'd understood the people I was dealing with better than I had. "There's something else," Aunt Helen continued. "Papers in his safe deposit box that I was supposed to give you if something like this ever happened. Evidence he'd been collecting for years. He documented every time your parents asked him for money, every scheme they'd tried, every manipulation they'd attempted. He knew that eventually they'd turn their attention to you, especially after you started building real wealth." The picture became clearer with each revelation. This wasn't the first time my parents had tried to access family money illegally. It was just the first time they'd succeeded, and only because I'd trusted them enough to be vulnerable. Uncle Tony had spent years protecting his assets from them, and he'd tried to protect mine too. That evening, driving to the family dinner in Lakewood, I felt calmer than I had all day, not because the betrayal hurt less, but because I finally understood the scope of what I was dealing with. This wasn't a family argument or a misunderstanding. It was a criminal enterprise run by people who'd raised me to trust them completely. The house looked exactly the same as always. Small but neat, the lawn carefully maintained, the kind of middle-class suburban home that suggested financial responsibility and modest success. Nothing about the exterior hinted at the fact that the people inside had stolen nearly $50,000 from their own daughter. I parked in the driveway behind Marcus's car, noting the expensive rims that definitely hadn't been there last month. Another purchase funded by my stolen credit, most likely. As I walked up the front steps, I could smell the steaks cooking and hear laughter from the backyard. Normal family sounds from people living abnormal lives. My mother greeted me at the door with her usual hug and bright smile. "There's my successful daughter," she said, squeezing me tight. "We're so proud of everything you've accomplished." The words felt like knives. They were proud of everything I'd accomplished because it had funded their lifestyle for months. I hugged her back, smiling just as brightly, playing the role of the loving daughter they expected me to be. "I'm proud of our family too," I said, and meant it in a way she'd never understood. Dinner was a masterclass in performance art. My father Kenneth grilled steaks with expensive seasonings, talking about the new tools he'd bought for the garage. My mother served sides and serving dishes I'd never seen before, casually mentioning that she'd found some deals at Williams-Sonoma. Marcus showed off his new watch, claiming he'd gotten it for a steal from a friend. Vanessa wore the tennis bracelet like it was a family heirloom, taking selfies and posting them with hashtags about being blessed. They performed their roles perfectly. The hard-working parents who'd raised a successful daughter, the siblings who were finding their own paths to success. Everyone was thriving, everyone was happy, everyone was grateful for family bonds that could never be broken. The conversation was warm, full of inside jokes and shared memory. They asked about the auto shop, celebrated a new contract I'd recently signed, and listened attentively as I talked about expanding the business. They seemed genuinely interested in my success, proud of my achievements, supportive of my plan. It would have been touching if I hadn't known they were cataloging every word for future theft opportunities. After dinner, as we sat around the living room with coffee and dessert, my mother brought up a topic that made my blood pressure spike. "You know, Natalie, your father and I have been thinking about our retirement planning. You're so good with money, and we trust your judgment completely. Maybe you could help us set up some investment accounts." The audacity was breathtaking. They'd stolen $50,000 from me and were now asking for investment advice so they could steal more efficiently. I smiled and nodded, making non-committal sounds about helping them research options. "That's so generous of you to offer help," Vanessa chimed in, unconsciously touching her stolen bracelet. "You're always looking out for everyone. Family takes care of family," Marcus added, and I wondered if he realized how accurately he'd described what I was about to do. As the evening wound down and I prepared to leave, my parents walked me to the door with their usual warmth. My mother hugged me again, telling me how much these family dinners meant to her. My father shook my hand and said he was proud to have raised such a responsible daughter. "See you soon, honey," my mother called as I got into my car, "and remember, if you ever need anything at all, we're here for you." I waved goodbye, smiling until I turned the corner and their house disappeared from view. Then I pulled over and sat in my car for 10 minutes, letting the full weight of their performance sink in. They'd stolen from me for months, were actively planning to steal more, and had spent the entire evening pretending to be loving parents who wanted nothing but my happiness. But they'd also given me something valuable that night. They'd shown me exactly how they operated, how they justified their actions, and how completely they underestimated my ability to respond. They saw me as their victim, their resource, their naive daughter who would always choose family loyalty over self-protection. Tomorrow they'd discover how wrong they were. Tomorrow they'd learn that their responsible, disciplined daughter had been paying attention to every lesson they'd ever taught her, including the ones they'd never meant to teach. As I drove home through the quiet Denver streets, I felt something I hadn't expected. Not just anger or determination, but a strange kind of gratitude. They'd shown me exactly who they were, and what they were capable of. Now it was time to show them the same courtesy. The mountain peaks glowed in the distance, outlined against the star-filled sky. Somewhere up there, Uncle Tony was probably laughing at the irony. The family that had spent years trying to access his money had finally succeeded with mine, but they'd also activated every protection he'd put in place, every lesson he'd taught me, every backup plan he'd insisted on creating. They thought they'd won the game by stealing my money. They had no idea the game was just beginning. The next morning, I woke up with the kind of clarity that comes from finally understanding the rules of the game you've been playing without realizing it. The Denver skyline stretched beyond my bedroom window, sharp and clean in the early light, and for the first time in months, I felt like I could see everything clearly. My appointment with attorney James Park was scheduled for 9 o'clock. I'd chosen him specifically because his firm specialized in financial fraud cases involving family members, a niche that apparently existed because people like my parents were more common than I'd ever imagined. The reviews were filled with stories similar to mine, children discovering that their trusted family members had been systematically stealing their identities and resources. I arrived at his office 15 minutes early, carrying a briefcase that had belonged to Uncle Tony. Inside were copies of every credit card statement, every suspicious transaction, and every piece of evidence I'd compiled over the past 36 hours. The receptionist offered coffee, which I declined. I needed to stay sharp for this conversation. Attorney Park was younger than I'd expected, maybe early 40s, with the kind of controlled intensity that suggested he'd seen cases like mine more often than anyone should have too. He listened without interruption, as I walked through the timeline of discovery, the pattern of theft, and the calculated way my family had accessed and used my credit card. "The systematic nature of this is actually helpful for your case," he said, spreading my documentation across his conference table. "Random identity theft is one thing, but coordinated fraud by family members who had legitimate access to your personal information creates specific legal avenues we can pursue." He pointed to several transactions that I'd highlighted. "These charges, made while you were at work, and can prove your location, establish that someone else was using your cards with forged signatures. The fact that the purchases align with items your family members acquired and documented on social media creates a clear pattern of intent. What kind of consequences are we talking about? I asked, surprised by how steady my voice sounded. Criminal charges for identity theft, fraud and forgery, civil recovery for the full amount stolen plus damages and legal fees. And depending on how deep this goes, potential charges for conspiracy if we can prove they planned this together. The word conspiracy hung in the air between us. It sounded so dramatic, so far removed from Sunday family dinners and childhood memories. But that's exactly what this was. A carefully orchestrated plan to steal from someone they'd raised to trust them completely. Attorney Park leaned back in his chair, studying my face. I have to ask, and I don't mean this to sound harsh, but are you prepared for what this process will do to your family relation? Once we file these charges, there's no going back to normal family dinners and holiday gatherings. I thought about Vanessa's tennis bracelet, Marcus's new gaming setup, my parents' casual discussion of retirement planning, while wearing clothes I'd unknowingly bought them. There's already no going back, I said. They made that choice when they decided to steal from me. He nodded approvingly. Good. Clients who hesitate or try to protect their abusers usually end up withdrawing the charges and getting victimized again. You seem clear about what you want. What I wanted was justice, but more than that, I wanted them to understand that actions had consequences. They'd spent months treating me like an ATM machine with unlimited funds and no oversight. Now they were about to discover that their ATM had security cameras, transaction logs, and a very good memory. After the legal consultation, I drove to the auto shop. It was a 20-minute trip through Denver traffic, giving me time to process everything Attorney Park had explained. The criminal charges would take months to wind through the system, but the civil case could move much faster. He'd recommended freezing all my credit cards immediately, and notifying the credit reporting agencies to prevent further damage. The shop sat on a corner lot in an older part of town, surrounded by small businesses that had been serving the community for decades. Uncle Tony had chosen the location carefully, close enough to residential neighborhoods that people could walk or take short drives for service, but with enough space for the larger commercial vehicles that provided steady income. When I pulled into the parking lot, I saw Rosa Martinez, my part-time office manager, unlocking the front door. She'd worked for Uncle Tony for 8 years, and had stayed on when I inherited the business, helping me navigate the transition from owner's niece to actual owner. She was one of the few people who knew the full story of how the shop had come to me, and she'd been invaluable in helping me understand the financial side of the operation. "Morning, Natalie," she called, waving me over. "I was just reviewing yesterday's appointment. We're booked solid through Friday, and I have 3 more estimate requests for next week." The success of the shop still amazed me sometimes. When Uncle Tony died, I'd worried that customers would leave, that the business would struggle without his personal relationships and reputation. Instead, the combination of quality work, fair pricing, and reliable service had created a steady stream of referrals. We were actually busier now than we'd been during Uncle Tony's final years. "That's great news," I said, following her into the office. "Rosa, I need to ask you something confidential. Have any of my family members ever been here when I wasn't around? Asked questions about the business, looked through files, anything like that?" She paused in the middle of sorting through paperwork, her expression shifting to concern. "Your mother was here about a month ago. She said she wanted to surprise you by organizing some of the older files, make things easier for you. I didn't think much of it at the time, because she's your family, but she spent about 2 hours going through the filing cabinets." My stomach dropped. The filing cabinets contained copies of all my business credit card information, account numbers and financial records. If my mother had spent 2 hours alone with those files, she'd had plenty of time to copy or photograph anything she wanted. "Did she take anything with her?" I asked, trying to keep my voice casual. Not that I saw, but I wasn't watching her the whole time. I was handling customers in the service bay. Should I have been more careful? "No, Rosa, you did nothing wrong. Family members should be trustworthy. I'm just trying to figure out some discrepancies in my business accounts." That was true technically. There were definitely discrepancies, and my family was definitely involved. I just hadn't mentioned that the discrepancies involved nearly $50,000 in unauthorized charges. I spent the next hour going through the filing system, checking to see what information my mother would have had access to during her helpful visit. Business credit card numbers, bank account information, vendor contact details, customer records, everything she'd need to understand the scope of my financial resources and how to access them without my knowledge. The violation felt different here, in the space Uncle Tony had built and trusted me to continue. This wasn't just about stealing my personal money anymore. They'd invaded the business he'd spent decades building, contaminated the workspace where I'd been learning to honor his legacy. The betrayal had layers I was still discovering. Around noon, I decided to drive to the bank where I'd held accounts since college. I needed to speak with someone face to face about the fraud protection measures, and I wanted to understand exactly how the unauthorized charges had been processed without triggering security alerts. Lisa Rodriguez, the branch manager, had helped me set up my business accounts when I inherited the shop. She was professional but warm, the kind of person who remembered personal details and asked about your goals during routine transactions. When I explained what had happened, her expression shifted from friendly professionalism to serious concern. "Natalie, I'm so sorry this happened to you. Family financial abuse is more common than people realize, and it's often the most devastating because the victims never see it coming." She pulled up my accounts on her computer, scrolling through months of transaction history. "The charges were processed normally because the signatures matched your signature on file," she explained. "Whoever used your cards had either practiced forging your signature or had access to documents with your real signature to copy." I thought about all the birthday cards, Christmas gifts, and legal documents I'd signed in front of my family over the years. Any of them could have provided a sample for practicing forgery, and my mother's visit to the auto shop had given her access to business documents with my signature on letterhead and contracts. "What's our next step for recovery?" "We'll start by freezing all the affected accounts and issuing new cards with different numbers. Then we'll file fraud reports with each card company and begin the process of disputing the unauthorized charges. With documentation and police reports, you should be able to recover most or all of the stolen funds." "How long does that usually take?" "For clear cases of family fraud with good documentation, usually 3 to 6 months. The card companies take these cases seriously, especially when there's evidence of systematic abuse over extended periods." As she processed the account freezes and new card requests, I felt a mixture of relief and anticipation. Relief that the bleeding would stop, that no new charges could appear on accounts my family could no longer access. Anticipation for the moment they discovered their golden goose had stopped laying eggs. That afternoon, I drove to Aunt Helen's house in a quiet neighborhood just outside downtown Denver. She'd lived in the same small bungalow for 20 years, a place that felt like a sanctuary filled with books, plants, and the kind of accumulated wisdom that comes from paying attention to life's pattern. She greeted me at the door with a hug that felt different from my mother's embrace the night before. Aunt Helen's hug was protective, understanding, free from hidden agendas and secret calculations. We sat in her living room with tea and homemade cookies while I brought her up to speed on my legal consultation and bank visit. "Your uncle would be proud of how you're handling this," she said after I'd finished explaining my day. "He always said that thieves count on their victims being too embarrassed or too loyal to fight back. But you're not embarrassed, and your loyalty was never supposed to be unconditional." She disappeared into her bedroom and returned with a small fireproof safe, the kind people keep important documents in during emergencies. Inside was a manila envelope with my name written in Uncle Tony's distinctive handwriting. "He gave this to me 6 months before he died," she said, placing it in my hands. "He said if anyone in your family ever tried to take advantage of your success, I should give this to you immediately." Inside the envelope were photocopies of documents I'd never seen before. Bank statements showing that my parents had asked Uncle Tony for loans multiple times over the years, small amounts that they'd promised to repay but never. Email exchanges where they'd tried to convince him to invest in various schemes, always requiring upfront money that would somehow multiply into fortune. Records of phone calls where they'd suggested he was being selfish by not sharing his success with family members who weren't as financially blessed. But the most damaging documents were the most recent ones. Screenshots of social media posts where my parents had complained about their financial struggles, claiming they'd been excluded from family wealth while their daughter and brother-in-law hoarded resources. Posts that painted Uncle Tony as greedy and me as spoiled, building a narrative that justified whatever they felt entitled to take. "He documented everything," Aunt Helen explained, "because he recognized the pattern. They'd tried the same approaches with other relatives over the years. Guilt, manipulation, claims of unfairness when people wouldn't hand over money they'd worked to earn." The final item in the envelope was a letter addressed to me, dated just 2 months before Uncle Tony's death. "Natalie," it began in his careful handwriting, "if you're reading this, it means the people who raised you have proven they care more about money than they care about you. I'm sorry you had to learn this lesson, but I'm not sorry you're strong enough to handle it. Your parents aren't bad people, but they've never learned the difference between wanting something and earning it. They see your success as something that happened to you by luck, not something you created through discipline and hard work. That makes them feel entitled to share in rewards they didn't help create. Don't let them convince you that protecting yourself makes you selfish or ungrateful. Family love isn't supposed to come with a price tag, and family loyalty isn't supposed to be a one-way transaction. You owe them the same level of respect and consideration they've shown you, nothing more. The business I left you isn't just about money. It's about understanding that real security comes from your own efforts, your own choices, your own value. Don't let anyone steal that from you, even if they share your DNA. Build something worthy of your character, not their expectations. Uncle Tony. I read the letter twice, feeling like he was sitting right there in Aunt Helen's living room, offering guidance exactly when I needed it most. He'd known this day would come, had prepared for it, had trusted me to handle it with the same practical wisdom he'd tried to teach me through example. There's one more thing, Aunt Helen said softly. He set up a separate account that you don't know about yet. Emergency funds that are completely protected from anyone trying to claim family connections or marital rights. He wanted you to have resources that could never be touched by people who might try to manipulate or control you. She handed me a bank book for an account at a credit union I'd never heard of. The balance showed $68,000, money that had been quietly earning interest for 2 years while I struggled to understand why my family had suddenly become so interested in my financial success. The account came with a note in Uncle Tony's handwriting. Emergency fund for emergency people, it read. Use it wisely. For the first time since discovering the theft, I felt something close to laughter. Even from beyond the grave, Uncle Tony was still protecting me from family members who confused love with access to resources. The irony was perfect. While my parents had been stealing money I'd earned, the uncle they'd criticized for being selfish had been secretly building a safety net to protect me from their theft. That evening, I returned to my loft with a sense of purpose I hadn't felt in years. Not just anger or determination, but actual excitement about the future I was going to build once I dealt with the people trying to steal it from me. I spent 2 hours on my laptop, researching every legal option Attorney Park had mentioned, reading case studies of similar family fraud situations, understanding the full scope of what I could pursue if I chose to be aggressive rather than merciful. The patterns were depressingly familiar. Trusted family members accessing accounts, forging signatures, making purchases they felt entitled to make, then expressing shock and hurt when confronted with evidence of their theft. But the outcomes varied dramatically depending on how the victims responded. Those who prioritized family harmony over justice usually ended up being victimized again within months. Those who pursued full legal consequences rarely had repeat problems, though they also rarely maintained close family relationships. The choice felt clear. I could have the illusion of family unity while being perpetually victimized, or I could have actual security while accepting that my family relationships would never be the same. Since my family had already changed the rules by deciding to steal from me, it seemed reasonable to change my response accordingly. Around 10 o'clock, my phone rang. Marcus, calling from what was probably his stolen gaming setup, using his new watch to check the time while deciding whether to interrupt my evening. Hey sis, he said, his voice carrying that casual warmth that would have been comforting yesterday but felt manipulative tonight. I was thinking about what you said at dinner, about expanding the auto shop. I might know some people who could help with financing or partnerships. Really? I said, settling back on my couch with a cup of tea. What kind of people? Just some guys I know who have experience with small business investments. They're always looking for good opportunities, and your shop has such a solid reputation. I almost admired the audacity. He'd stolen thousands of dollars from me and was now trying to set up additional opportunities to access my business resources through his friend. The shop that was finally profitable after 2 years of careful management was apparently just another target for his expanding network of opportunists. That sounds interesting, I said. I'd love to meet them. Maybe we could all have dinner this weekend and discuss some possibility. Absolutely, Marcus said, and I could hear the satisfaction in his voice. I'll set something up. These guys are going to be really impressed with what you've built. After we hung up, I made a note in my journal about the conversation. Attorney Park had mentioned that evidence of ongoing schemes and future plans for theft could strengthen both criminal and civil cases. Marcus had just provided exactly that kind of evidence, documented in my phone's call log and ready to be transcribed for legal proceeding. The next morning brought a text message from my mother that made my coffee taste bitter. Honey, I hope you don't mind, but I gave your phone number to a friend of mine who's looking for someone to help with her small business bookkeeping. I told her you were the most trustworthy person I knew with money. The message was followed by a laughing emoji and a heart, as if she'd done me a favor by sharing my contact information with strangers, while simultaneously stealing from me on a scale that could have destroyed my credit rating and financial future. But underneath the surface meaning was something more calculated. She was testing to see if I suspected anything, using my reaction to gauge whether I'd discovered the theft. A normal response would be mild annoyance at having my number shared without permission, followed by polite willingness to help a friend of the family. I texted back, "Thanks for thinking of me. I'm always happy to help family friends. You know me, I love talking about money management and financial responsibility." The response came back within minutes. "You're such a good daughter. Dad and I are so lucky to have raised someone who understands the importance of family helping family, family helping family." The phrase would have been touching if she hadn't been typing it on a phone I'd paid for while wearing clothes purchased with my stolen credit cards. The cognitive dissonance was staggering. She genuinely seemed to believe that stealing from me was a form of family cooperation, while my willingness to help her friends represented the values she'd successfully instilled in me. That afternoon, I received a call from the credit card company's fraud department. They'd reviewed the disputes I'd filed and wanted to verify some details about the unauthorized charges. The investigator, a woman named Carol with a crisp professional voice, walked through each suspicious transaction methodically. "The pattern here is very clear," she said after we'd reviewed 2 months of charges. "These aren't random purchases by strangers. Someone with detailed knowledge of your habits and preferences made these charges, someone who knew exactly how to forge your signature, and which purchases would be least likely to trigger security alerts." "What happens next?" I asked. "We'll credit your account for the full amount of fraudulent charges, which should appear within 2 business days. We'll also flag your file to prevent similar abuse in the future, and will cooperate fully with any criminal investigation if you choose to pursue charge. The credits will show up as refunds on my account. Exactly, $47,892.15 will be credited back to your account, along with any interest charges or fees associated with the fraudulent transaction." After she hung up, I sat in my office at the auto shop, staring at the phone and processing what had just happened. In less than a week, I'd gone from discovering devastating theft to having every stolen dollar restored to my account. The credit card companies had insurance for exactly this kind of fraud, which meant my family's theft had cost them nothing, and gained them everything they'd purchased with my cards. But that was about to change. The credit card companies would pursue collection for the fraudulent charge, seeking repayment from whoever had made the unauthorized purchases. My family was about to discover that their free shopping spree had been financed by credit, not gifts, and the bills were coming due. More importantly, the fraud reports would create an official paper trail linking specific purchases to specific individuals. Every item they'd bought and documented on social media, every charge that corresponded to their sudden acquisitions of expensive items, every transaction that proved their coordinated theft scheme. They'd spent months building evidence against themselves, documenting their crimes on Instagram and Facebook, creating timestamps and location data that perfectly corroborated the financial records of their theft. They'd turned their own social media accounts into prosecution exhibits, all while thinking they were celebrating their successful manipulation of their naive daughter. The irony was so perfect it almost felt like cosmic justice. They'd raised me to be careful, documented, and thorough in everything I did. Now I was going to use those same qualities to hold them accountable for what they'd done to me. That evening, I called Aunt Helen to update her on the day's development. She listened quietly as I explained the credit card company's response, the timeline for account restoration, and Attorney Park's strategy for criminal charges. "Your uncle always said that thieves defeat themselves," she said when I'd finished. "They get so focused on taking what doesn't belong to them that they forget to cover their tracks or consider the consequences." "I still can't believe they thought they'd get away with this," I said. "Did they really think I'd never notice $50,000 in charge?" "They thought you'd notice but wouldn't do anything about it," Aunt Helen replied. "People like your parents count on their victims being too embarrassed, too loyal, or too conflict-averse to fight back. They've probably gotten away with smaller versions of this for years with other people." That insight hit harder than I'd expected. This wasn't their first theft, just their most ambitious one. They'd spent years testing boundaries, seeing how much they could take from various people before anyone pushed back. I'd just been their biggest target because I'd built the most wealth for them to steal. The realization made my resolve even stronger. If I let this slide, if I chose family harmony over justice, they'd just move on to their next victim or return to me when they thought enough time had passed for me to forgive and forget. The only way to stop the pattern was to make the consequences severe enough that they'd never consider it worth the risk again. Saturday morning, I woke up early and drove to the auto shop to catch up on paperwork and think through my next step. The weekend was quiet, giving me space to process everything that had happened and plan for the confrontation I knew was coming soon. Around noon, my phone buzzed with a text from Vanessa. Emergency family meeting at mom and dad's house tonight at 7. Something important came up. Can you be there? The emergency family meeting wasn't a surprise. They'd probably started receiving calls from credit card companies about disputed charges. Or maybe their cards had been declined when they'd tried to make new purchases. Either way, they'd figured out that their access to my money had been cut off, and they needed to strategize a response. I texted back, "Of course, is everything okay?" Her response was immediate, "Just some confusion about some charges on credit card. Nothing serious, but we want to get it sorted out quickly." Nothing serious. $50,000 in theft was nothing serious because they'd never planned to pay for any of it themselves. From their perspective, this was just a minor inconvenience that needed to be managed, not a major crime that deserved consequences. But they'd made one crucial mistake in their calculations. They'd assumed I'd want to avoid family conflict more than I'd want justice for their theft. They'd counted on my love for them being stronger than my respect for myself. Tonight, they were going to discover how wrong they'd been about both assumptions. The drive to my parents' house that evening felt different from every other trip I'd made down those familiar streets. The sun was setting behind the mountains, casting long shadows across the suburban landscape, and I found myself noticing details I'd never paid attention to before. The expensive cars and driveways that didn't match the modest home. The perfectly manicured lawns that suggested homeowners with either significant disposable income or serious credit card debt. The general air of prosperity that might or might not reflect actual financial stability. I'd spent the afternoon preparing for this confrontation in ways my family couldn't possibly anticipate. In my purse was a small digital recorder, fully charged and tested. In my phone were screenshots of every social media post that corresponded to fraudulent charges, organized by date and family member. In my car was a folder containing copies of every document Attorney Park had recommended I bring to family discussions, including police report numbers and fraud case references. But more importantly, in my mind was a crystal clear understanding of exactly what I wanted to accomplish tonight. This wasn't going to be an emotional confrontation where hurt feelings and family loyalty clouded the real issues. This was going to be a business meeting where facts were presented, consequences were explained, and decisions were documented for future legal proceedings. The house looked exactly the same as always, but I felt like I was seeing it through different eyes. The new outdoor furniture on the porch that I'd apparently purchased without knowing it. The updated landscaping that had probably been funded by my stolen credit card. The fresh paint on the shutters that looked suspiciously like a recent home improvement project I'd unknowingly financed. Marcus's car was already in the driveway, along with Vanessa's compact sedan, that I now suspected had been purchased with better financing terms than her retail job should have qualified her for. They'd all arrived early, probably to coordinate their story and decide how to handle what they assumed would be a minor family dispute about some confusing credit card charges. I sat in my car for a moment, taking 3 deep breaths and centering myself in the calm, practical mindset Uncle Tony had always modeled during difficult conversations. He'd taught me that emotion was information, not instruction. I could feel angry about what they'd done without letting that anger control how I responded to it. My mother answered the door with her usual bright smile, but I caught something different in her eyes, a tightness around the edges that suggested stress she was trying to hide. She hugged me as always, but the embrace felt performative, like she was checking off a box on a list of normal behaviors rather than expressing genuine affection. "Thanks for coming so quickly, honey," she said, leading me toward the living room where the rest of the family was already gathered. "I know you're busy with the shop, but this seemed important enough to discuss in person." The living room had been arranged like an informal tribunal. My parents sat together on the couch, Marcus in the recliner to their right, Vanessa cross-legged on the floor with her laptop open. They'd clearly been deep in conversation before I arrived, and they all looked up as I entered with expressions that tried to convey concern but mostly revealed anxiety. "Sit down, Natalie," my father said, gesturing to the empty chair they'd positioned directly across from the couch. "We need to talk about some problems with credit card companies." I settled into the chair, placing my purse beside me where I could easily access the recorder if needed. "What kind of problems?" Vanessa looked up from her laptop screen. "There are some charges being disputed on cards that are apparently connected to your accounts. The credit card companies are saying someone used your cards without permission, but that doesn't make sense because we're family." The logic was breathtaking in its simplicity. They'd stolen my credit cards, but since we were family, it couldn't actually be theft. The crime was negated by our genetic relationship, As if DNA provided some kind of legal immunity for financial fraud. Which charges are being disputed? I asked, keeping my voice neutral and curious. My mother pulled out a folder full of papers, spreading them across the coffee table between us. They were printouts of credit card statements, with certain transactions highlighted in yellow. Every single highlighted charge was something they'd purchased and documented on social media over the past 3 months. These are all legitimate family expenses, she explained, pointing to various line items. Things we bought for the household, gifts for family members, shared experiences that benefit everyone. But somehow the credit card companies think these are fraudulent transactions. Marcus leaned forward in his chair. The whole thing is ridiculous. We're not strangers who stole your wallet. We're your family. Everything we bought was with good intentions. And most of it benefits you too. I studied the highlighted transactions, noting that they'd been remarkably thorough in documenting their theft. The tennis bracelet Vanessa never took off. The gaming equipment Marcus showed off constantly on social media. The vacation my parents had taken to Aspen, complete with photos of them skiing and dining at expensive restaurants. The kitchen appliances my mother used to cook the meals she served when I came for dinner. Help me understand something, I said, maintaining the same neutral tone. How did you get access to my credit cards to make these purchases? The question hung in the air for a moment too long. They'd clearly prepared explanations for why the purchases weren't theft, but they hadn't anticipated being asked to explain how they'd gained access to the cards in the first place. My father cleared his throat. You left some cards here a few months ago, and we just used them for family things. We didn't think you'd mind since everything we bought was for good reasons. Which cards did I leave here? Another pause. Vanessa looked at Marcus, who looked at my parents, who looked at each other. They were realizing in real time that their story had holes they hadn't considered. I'm not sure exactly, my mother said finally. They were just sitting on the kitchen counter, so we assumed you'd left them for family use. I opened my purse and pulled out my phone, scrolling to the Notes app where I documented every conversation with the credit card company. That's interesting, because I have records showing that charges were made on 5 different cards over a 3-month period. That's a lot of cards to accidentally leave on someone's kitchen counter. The silence stretched uncomfortably. Vanessa closed her laptop and set it aside, apparently deciding that whatever she'd been researching wasn't going to help with this particular conversation. The specific details don't really matter, Marcus said, his voice taking on a slightly defensive edge. The point is that we're family, and family helps each other. Everything we bought was reasonable, and it's not like you couldn't afford it. There it was, the justification I'd been waiting for. They'd stolen nearly $50,000 from me, but it was acceptable because we were related and they'd decided I could afford to be robbed. Let me make sure I understand your position, I said, pulling out a small notebook and pen. You believe that being family gives you the right to use my credit cards without permission, and that my ability to afford unauthorized charges makes those charges acceptable. Don't make it sound so cold, my mother interjected. We're not talking about strangers committing crime. We're talking about family members sharing resources during challenging times. What challenging times? The question seemed to surprise them. They looked around at each other, apparently trying to remember what financial crisis had supposedly justified their theft. Well, you know, Vanessa said vaguely, just the usual stuff. Bills, expenses, trying to get ahead. Everyone's struggling these days. I looked around the living room, noting the new electronics, the expensive decorative items, the general air of prosperity that definitely didn't suggest people who were struggling to pay basic bills. Help me understand the struggling part, I said. Marcus, didn't you just get promoted to assistant manager at the electronics store? Yeah, but that doesn't mean I'm rich, he replied. And Vanessa, aren't you working full-time at the boutique downtown? Full-time retail doesn't pay much, she said defensively. Mom, Dad, didn't you both get raises this year? My parents exchanged glances. Raises don't keep up with inflation, my father said. Everything costs more these days. I made notes as they spoke, documenting their explanations for future reference. They weren't struggling financially. They were living beyond their means, and had decided that my resources should supplement their lifestyle choices. So the challenging times aren't about inability to pay basic living expenses, I summarized. They're about wanting to afford things that cost more than your current incomes allow. That's not fair, my mother said, her voice rising slightly. We've always been a family that shares and helps each other. When you were growing up, we shared everything we had with you. The emotional manipulation was expertly deployed. They'd raised me, fed me, housed me, and loved me, which apparently created a debt that could be collected through credit card fraud. My childhood had been financed by their sacrifices, so my adulthood should finance their want. You're absolutely right, I said, and watched relief wash over their faces. You did share everything with me when I was growing up. You taught me about budgeting, saving money, living within my means, and being responsible with credit. Those are valuable lessons that have served me well. The relief faded as they realized where this was heading. You also taught me that taking things without permission is stealing, regardless of your relationship to the owner. You taught me that good intentions don't justify bad action. And you taught me that real love doesn't come with financial obligations. Marcus shifted uncomfortably in his chair. Come on, Natalie, don't turn this into some kind of moral lecture. We're just trying to work out a simple misunderstanding. What's the misunderstanding? The credit card companies think unauthorized people used your cards. But we're not unauthorized. We're your family. I opened my purse and pulled out the digital recorder, setting it on the coffee table between us. Do you mind if I record the rest of this conversation? I want to make sure I understand everyone's position clearly. The reaction was immediate and telling. All four of them tensed visibly, exchanging glances that suggested they were suddenly aware this conversation might have consequences beyond family dinner awkwardness. Why do you need to record anything? Vanessa asked. For clarity, I replied. There seems to be some confusion about what happened, and I want to make sure everyone's version of events is documented accurately. That seems unnecessary, my father said. We're family. We should be able to work this out without involving lawyers or recording devices. The mention of lawyers was interesting. I hadn't said anything about legal involvement, but he'd made the connection between recorded conversations and potential legal proceedings. I agree that family should be able to work things out, I said. That's why I'm here. I want to understand your perspective and share mine, so we can find a solution that works for everyone. My mother leaned forward, her expression shifting to the concerned parent mode she'd perfected over the years. Honey, you seem upset about this whole situation. I understand that credit card disputes can be stressful, but we're all on the same side here. What side is that? The family side, she said, as if it were obvious. We all want what's best for each other, and we all want to resolve this misunderstanding without creating problems for anyone. I made another note in my notebook. They kept referring to systematic credit card fraud as a misunderstanding, as if the theft had been accidental rather than coordinated and deliberate. Let me share my perspective, I said, closing the notebook and looking directly at each of them in turn. Over the past 3 months, 5 of my credit cards were used to make unauthorized purchases totaling $47,892.15. The purchases were made by people who forged my signature, used cards they had no legal right to access, and spent money they had no intention of repaying. The room was completely silent. They stared at me like I'd suddenly started speaking a foreign language. That's not a misunderstanding, I continued. That's identity theft, credit card fraud, and forgery. Those are serious crimes with serious consequences, regardless of the relationship between the perpetrator and the victim. Marcus was the first to recover his voice. You're making this sound way more dramatic than it is. Nobody committed any crimes. We just used some cards for family expenses. Which cards did you use, specifically? I don't remember the specific numbers. Do you remember how you got access to them? They were just available for family use. Did you have my permission to use them? A longer pause. We assumed it was okay because we're family. I wrote down his exact words, then looked up at Vanessa. Same questions for you. Which cards did you use? I might have used 1 or 2 for some purchases, she said carefully. Do you remember how you got access to them? Mom said it was okay to use them for family things. I turned to my parents. So you had possession of my credit cards and gave permission for other family members to use them. My mother's composure was beginning to crack. This is getting out of hand, Natalie. You're treating us like criminals instead of family members who made some mistakes. What mistake? Maybe we should have asked permission first. But everything we bought was reasonable and nothing was wasted on frivolous things. I pulled out my phone and opened the folder of screenshots I'd prepared. Let me read some of the charges that you consider reasonable and not frivolous. I scrolled through the first page of transactions. Tiffany & Co., $3,400. Louis Vuitton, $2,800. The Broadmoor Resort, $4,200 for a 5-day stay. Best Buy, $3,000 for gaming equipment. Williams-Sonoma, $800 for kitchen appliances. With each item I read, their expressions grew more uncomfortable. When the charges were just numbers on statements, they could maintain the fiction that these were modest family expenses. When I read the actual amounts and vendors, the scope of their theft became undeniable. Those are just the biggest single purchases, I continued. There are also dozens of smaller charges for restaurants, clothing stores, gas stations, grocery stores and online retailers, all made without my knowledge or permission, all paid for with credit that's legally my responsibility. Vanessa spoke up, her voice smaller than before. We didn't realize it added up to so much. You didn't realize, or you didn't care. That's not fair. What's not fair is stealing $50,000 from someone who trusted you completely. The word stealing landed like a physical blow. They all reacted as if I'd slapped them, faces flushing with a combination of anger and embarrassment. Don't use that word, my father said sharply. We're not thieves. We're family members who made some poor financial decisions. What's the difference? Thieves steal from strangers for selfish reasons. We used family resources during a difficult time, with good intentions. I looked at him steadily. You took money that didn't belong to you, without permission, with no intention of paying it back. That's the definition of theft, regardless of your relationship to the victim or your intentions. The silence that followed was different from the earlier pause. This wasn't them trying to think of explanations or justifications. This was them realizing that their narrative of family cooperation and shared resources wasn't going to work with someone who understood exactly what they'd done and what it was called. My mother tried one more approach. Honey, I can see that you're hurt and upset about this situation. Maybe we all made mistakes in how we handled things. But we're family, and family forgives each other and works together to solve problems. I agree, I said. Family should work together to solve problems. So let's talk about solutions. Relief washed over their faces again. They thought I was ready to negotiate, to find some middle ground where their theft could be reframed as a family loan or a misunderstanding that could be resolved with apologies and promise. The credit card companies have already restored all the stolen money to my accounts, I said, and watched their relief turn to confusion. So from a financial standpoint, I'm not damaged by your theft. The money you stole has been returned to me with interest. That's great, Marcus said, sounding genuinely relieved. So there's no real problem then. Actually, there's still a significant problem. The credit card companies didn't just forgive the charge, they classified them as fraudulent, and are pursuing collection from whoever made the unauthorized purchases. The confusion deepened. They looked at each other like I was explaining a complex mathematical equation they couldn't follow. What does that mean? Vanessa asked. It means the credit card companies are going to want repayment for every fraudulent charge, plus interest, fees, and penalties. They're also going to report the fraud to credit agencies and law enforcement agencies. The room went completely silent. For the first time since I'd arrived, they seemed to understand that this situation might have consequences that extended beyond family dynamics. But we can't afford to pay back $50,000, my mother said, her voice barely above a whisper. Then you probably shouldn't have spent $50,000 of someone else's money. My father stood up abruptly, his face flushed with anger. This is ridiculous, Natalie. You're destroying this family over money. We raised you better than. I remained seated, keeping my voice calm and level. You raised me to understand that actions have consequences. You're experiencing those consequences now. We're your parents, he said, his voice rising. You can't just turn us into credit card companies and police like we're strangers. I didn't turn you in. You turned yourselves in when you documented your crimes on social media and left a paper trail that connects every stolen purchase to the person who made it. Marcus pulled out his phone, probably to check his Instagram posts that featured his new gaming equipment. Vanessa unconsciously touched her tennis bracelet. My parents looked around the room at all the items they'd purchased with my stolen credit, apparently just now realizing that they'd created evidence against themselves. This is insane, Marcus said, still scrolling through his phone. You're going to send your own family to jail over some credit card confusion. I'm not sending anyone anywhere, I replied. I'm simply not going to lie to credit card companies and law enforcement agencies to protect you from the consequences of your own choices. The distinction was important. I wasn't actively pursuing revenge or trying to hurt them. I was refusing to participate in covering up their crimes, which was a very different thing. My mother sat back down heavily, her face pale. What do you want from us, Natalie? What would it take for you to call off the credit card companies and make this go away? There it was, the negotiation phase, where they tried to figure out what price would buy my silence and complicity in their theft. I want you to understand what you did and take responsibility for it, I said. I want you to acknowledge that this wasn't a family loan or a misunderstanding or a reasonable sharing of resources. This was theft, and it was wrong, and it damaged our relationship in ways that can't be fixed by paying money or making promises. Fine, my father said quickly. We acknowledge that we made mistakes. We're sorry. Now what do we need to do to fix it? You can start by being honest about how you gained access to my credit cards. Another pause. They looked at each other, apparently trying to decide how much truth they could admit without creating additional problems for themselves. Your mother copied some card information when she was organizing files at your shop, my father said finally. She didn't think it would be a problem because everything we bought was for family purposes. They'd moved from claiming I'd left cards at their house to admitting that my mother had stolen financial information from my business during a visit where she'd pretended to be helping me organize files. And how did you coordinate the purchases between different family members? We just talked about what people needed and used the most appropriate cards for different purchases, my mother said. Another note. They'd admitted to coordinating their theft, discussing purchases in advance, and systematically using different cards to avoid detection. This wasn't impulsive spending or poor judgment. This was organized financial fraud. Do you understand why this is more serious than a family disagreement about money? I asked. It's only serious if you make it serious, Vanessa. Families deal with money problems all the time without involving lawyers and police. Families deal with money problems, I agreed. But this isn't a money problem. This is a crime problem. And crimes have legal consequences regardless of family relationship. The word crime hit them like a physical blow again. They were still trying to maintain the fiction that this was a family dispute rather than a legal matter, but their own admissions had made that impossible. So what happens now? Marcus asked, his voice subdued. Now you deal with the consequences of your choices, I said, standing up and gathering my things. The credit card companies will contact you about repayment. The credit agencies will adjust your credit ratings based on the fraud report, and law enforcement will investigate based on the evidence you've provided through your own documentation of the crimes. You can't just leave, my mother said, panic creeping into her voice. We need to figure out how to fix this. There's nothing to fix, I replied. You made your choices, and now you'll live with the results. That's how consequences work. I walked toward the door, then paused and turned back to face them one more time. You taught me that family members should be able to trust each other completely, I said. You violated that trust in the most fundamental way possible. You taught me that actions have consequences. Now you get to learn that lesson yourselves. Walking out of that house felt like stepping through a doorway into a completely different life. The cool evening air hit my face as I crossed the threshold, and I realized I'd been holding my breath for most of the conversation. Behind me I could hear frantic voices rising as my family processed what had just happened, but their words felt distant and irrelevant now. I drove home in complete silence. No music, no phone calls, just the sound of my own breathing and the hum of traffic around me. The familiar streets of Denver looked different somehow, as if the confrontation had shifted the lens through which I viewed everything. The city lights seemed brighter, the mountain silhouettes sharper against the darkening sky. My phone started buzzing before I'd even reached my apartment building. Text messages, missed calls, voicemails piling up as my family launched into damage control mode. I didn't check any of them. Whatever panic or anger or desperate bargaining they wanted to share could wait until morning or longer. The silence in my loft felt sacred after the tension of the evening. I set my purse down carefully, hung up my jacket, and made myself a cup of tea with the deliberate slowness of someone who had nowhere urgent to be and nothing urgent to do. For the first time in weeks I felt completely at peace with my circumstances. My phone kept buzzing. Finally I turned it off entirely and placed it in a drawer, physically removing the option of being pulled back into their crisis. Tonight was mine and I was going to spend it processing what had just happened without interference from people who'd proven they couldn't be trusted with access to my thoughts or resources. I settled onto my couch with my tea and opened my journal to a fresh page. At the top I wrote the date and the words "The Reckoning." Then I began documenting everything I could remember from the conversation. Not just what they'd said but how they'd said it, what their body language had revealed, and how their story had evolved as they realized their initial justifications weren't working. The most striking thing was how genuinely surprised they'd seemed by my refusal to help them avoid consequences. They'd expected anger, hurt feelings, maybe some negotiation about repayment terms. They hadn't expected calm, methodical documentation of their crimes and a complete unwillingness to participate in covering up their theft. They'd built their entire plan around the assumption that family loyalty would trump everything else, that I'd ultimately choose relationship harmony over personal justice. Even when confronted with undeniable evidence of systematic theft, they'd continued trying to reframe the situation as a family disagreement rather than a criminal matter. But the most revealing moment had been when my father asked what I wanted from them, clearly expecting me to name a price for my silence. The idea that I might want actual accountability rather than financial compensation had never occurred to them. They understood transactional relationships but not ethical ones. I wrote until my hand cramped, documenting every detail I could remember for future reference. Attorney Park had emphasized the importance of contemporaneous records, and I wanted to capture not just what they'd admitted to, but how they'd justified their actions, and what their expectations had been for resolving the situation. Around midnight, I finally felt ready to check my phone. 17 missed calls, 23 text messages, and 4 voicemails. The progression from panic to anger to desperate bargaining was clearly visible in the timestamps and senders. The first few messages were from my mother, sent within minutes of my departure. "Honey, please come back so we can work this out together. We're family and we love you. I know you're upset, but we can fix this if we just talk calmly. Please don't do anything rash while you're emotional." Then Marcus had taken over, trying a more aggressive approach. "This is insane, Natalie. You're going to destroy the whole family over money. We're your blood. That has to count for something. You're making a huge mistake that you'll regret forever." Vanessa had chosen emotional manipulation. "I can't believe my own sister would choose money over family. This is going to kill Mom and Dad. Is that what you want? Please think about what you're doing to all of us." The voicemails followed similar patterns, cycling through pleading, anger, guilt-tripping, and attempts at logical negotiation. But what struck me most was that none of them, not a single message, contained an actual apology for stealing from me. They were sorry I was upset, sorry the situation had become complicated, sorry I was overreacting, but none of them expressed remorse for the theft itself. The final message was from my father, left just an hour earlier. His voice was different from the others, quieter and more calculated. "Natalie, I think you should know that we've been talking to someone who understands these kinds of family financial situations. There might be ways to resolve this that you haven't considered. Call me back when you're ready to discuss this rationally." The threat was subtle but unmistakable. They'd consulted with someone, probably a lawyer, who told them they might have options for fighting back against my fraud reports. They were no longer just trying to convince me to drop the matter. They were preparing to challenge my right to report their theft. I made notes about each message, then turned the phone off again. Whatever strategy they were developing could wait until I'd had time to think clearly about my next moves. The next morning brought clarity along with the sunrise. I woke up naturally, without an alarm, feeling more rested than I had in months. The constant underlying stress of family relationships built on lies and hidden agendas was gone, replaced by the clean simplicity of dealing with people who'd revealed their true nature. I made coffee and breakfast with deliberate slowness, savoring the luxury of a morning without deception or performance. No need to pretend I didn't know about the theft. No need to carefully monitor my words to avoid revealing what I'd discovered. No need to smile and play the role of the trusting daughter while people I loved systematically robbed me. My first call was to Attorney Park's office. The receptionist scheduled an emergency meeting for later that morning, warning me that weekend consultations came with premium fees. I assured her that urgent legal advice was worth whatever it cost, especially since I now had recordings and admissions that significantly strengthened my case. The second call was to Aunt Helen. She answered on the first ring, as if she'd been waiting for my update. "How did it go?" she asked without preamble. "Better than I expected," I said, settling into my favorite chair by the window. They admitted to everything, explained their methods, and made it clear that they see theft as acceptable when it's committed by family members against other family members. Did they seem to understand the seriousness of what they've done? They understand that there might be consequences, but they don't understand that those consequences are deserved. They're more focused on avoiding punishment than acknowledging wrongdoing. Aunt Helen was quiet for a moment. "Your uncle always said that people reveal their true character when they're caught doing something wrong. Some people take responsibility and try to make amends. Others double down and try to avoid accountability. They're definitely in the second category." My father left a message suggesting they've consulted with someone about fighting my fraud reports. That's not surprising. People like your parents rarely accept consequences quietly. They usually try to find ways to turn themselves into victims of the people they've wronged. The insight was uncomfortably accurate. Based on their messages, they were already constructing a narrative where I was the villain, destroying an innocent family over minor financial misunderstandings. After we hung up, I spent an hour researching family financial fraud cases online, reading about similar situations and their outcomes. The patterns were depressingly consistent. Family members stole money, got caught, tried to reframe theft as loans or sharing, then attempted to make their victims feel guilty for pursuing consequence. The successful cases were the ones where victims refused to be manipulated by family loyalty arguments and pursued full legal accountability. The unsuccessful cases were the ones where victims allowed emotional manipulation to override legal justice, usually resulting in continued financial abuse. My appointment with Attorney Park was scheduled for 11 o'clock. I arrived early, bringing printed copies of my journal entries from the previous evening along with screenshots of all the messages my family had sent after I left their house. He reviewed everything methodically, occasionally nodding or making notes in his legal pad. When he finished, he looked up with the expression of someone who'd seen similar cases many times before. This is actually much stronger than most family fraud cases. They've provided detailed admissions of how they gained access to your cards, how they coordinated their purchases, and how they justified their actions. Most defendants try to deny everything and force us to prove intent. What about their threat to fight the fraud report? They can try, but they'll be fighting their own recorded admissions. Any lawyer they've consulted has probably already explained that their best option is negotiating plea agreements, rather than challenging the underlying facts. He flipped through several pages of notes. The criminal charges are essentially guaranteed at this point. The question is whether they'll accept responsibility and negotiate reduced sentences, or whether they'll try to fight and face the full penalties. What are the full penalties? For systematic credit card fraud at this level, we're looking at potential felony charges with prison time ranging from 2 to 5 years, depending on their criminal history and willingness to make restitution. The civil penalties could include full repayment plus damages, which might double or triple the actual amount stolen. The numbers were staggering. My family's decision to steal $50,000 could result in financial obligations exceeding $100,000, plus criminal records that would affect their employment and housing options for years. Is there any scenario where this gets resolved without criminal charge? I asked. Only if they make full restitution immediately and you choose not to cooperate with the prosecution. But based on what you've told me about their financial situation, immediate full restitution isn't realistic. He closed his folder and looked at me directly. I need to ask you the same question I asked before. Are you prepared for this to completely destroy your relationships with these family members? Because once criminal charges are filed, there's no going back to normal family dinners and holiday gatherings. I thought about Uncle Tony's letter, about Aunt Helen's warnings, about the months of systematic theft that had been happening while I trusted them completely. Those relationships were already destroyed. I just didn't know it yet. That afternoon, I drove to the auto shop to catch up on work and think about my next steps in familiar surroundings. Rosa was there handling some weekend paperwork, and she looked up with relief when I walked in. "Thank goodness you're here. Your mother has been calling all morning, asking when you'd be in. She sounds pretty upset about something. She's dealing with some personal financial issues," I said, which was technically accurate. "If she calls again, please just tell her I'm busy with customers and will call her back when I have time." Rosa nodded, but her expression suggested she sensed there was more to the story. She'd worked for Uncle Tony long enough to recognize family drama when she saw it, and she'd probably noticed the tension during my mother's previous visit to the shop. I spent the afternoon reviewing the shop's books and planning some improvements I'd been considering. The business was thriving in ways that Uncle Tony probably hadn't imagined when he'd left it to me. Revenue was steady, customer satisfaction was high, and we had enough cash flow to invest in better equipment and possibly expand services. But more than the financial success, I felt proud of what the shop represented. It was something I'd built through my own work, knowledge I'd gained through my own effort, relationships I'd developed through my own integrity. Nobody could steal it from me, manipulate me out of it, or claim they deserved access to it because of family connections. Around 4 o'clock, Marcus showed up unannounced. I saw him through the office window, pacing in the parking lot like he was working up courage for a difficult conversation. Finally, he walked through the front door with the kind of forced casualness that suggested careful preparation. "Hey sis, he said, looking around the shop with what seemed like genuine appreciation. This place is really doing well. Uncle Tony would be proud. Thanks, I replied, not moving from behind the desk where I'd been working. What brings you by? I was hoping we could talk about last night, away from Mom and Dad, just the two of us. I gestured to the chair across from my desk. I'm listening. He sat down, Dalu, running his hands through his hair in a gesture I remembered from childhood when he was trying to figure out how to explain something he'd done wrong. Look, I know we screwed up, he began. Maybe we screwed up more than I realized at first. But we're family, and I think there's got to be a way to work this out without involving lawyers and police and all that. What kind of way? I don't know, maybe we pay you back over time, or work out some kind of arrangement. I mean, it's not like we spent the money on drugs or gambling or anything terrible. We bought normal stuff that normal people buy. The logic was familiar. The theft was acceptable because the purchases were reasonable, as if the appropriateness of the items somehow justified the criminal method of acquiring them. Marcus, help me understand something, I said. If you needed those normal things that normal people buy, why didn't you just buy them with your own money? Because we couldn't afford them, he said, then seemed to realize how that sounded. I mean, we could afford some of them, but not all at once, and there were some opportunities that seemed too good to pass up. So you stole money from me to buy things you couldn't afford. We borrowed money, he corrected. We were planning to pay you back, without my knowledge or permission. We figured you wouldn't mind, since everything we bought was reasonable and you were doing so well financially. I made notes as he spoke, documenting the same justifications I'd heard the night before. They seemed genuinely unable to understand the difference between borrowing with permission and stealing without it. Let me ask you something else, I said. If you'd asked me directly for $50,000 to buy all these things, what do you think I would have said? Marcus shifted uncomfortably. Probably that it was too much money to spend on stuff like that, and if I'd said no, what would you have done? I guess we would have done without some of the things, or saved up longer, or found cheaper alternatives. So you knew I wouldn't have approved of these purchases if you'd asked permission. That's not the point, he said, his voice rising slightly. The point is that we're family, and family should be able to count on each other for help during tough times. Were you having tough times, or were you having expensive wants? The question hung in the air between us. Marcus looked around the shop, apparently trying to find an answer that would justify their theft without admitting to pure greed. Maybe a little of both, he said finally. And you decided that your wants were more important than my right to control my own money. We decided that family relationships were more important than being rigid about money. I leaned back in my chair, studying his face. He genuinely seemed to believe that stealing from me had been an act of family love, that my objection to being robbed represented some kind of selfish attachment to material possessions. Marcus, do you understand that what you did was illegal regardless of your intentions or our relationship? Technically, maybe, but lots of things are technically illegal that aren't really harmful. Families bend rules for each other all the time. $50,000 in credit card fraud isn't bending rules, it's committing serious crime. Only if you make it serious, he said, echoing Vanessa's words from the night before. If you just let it go, then it's just a family money issue that got resolved. The circular logic was astounding. The crime only existed if I reported it, so by reporting it I was creating the problem rather than addressing it. Let me make sure I understand your position, I said. You believe that crimes against family members aren't really crimes unless the victims choose to make them crimes by reporting them. That's not what I'm saying. Then what are you saying? I'm saying that families should handle family problems privately, without involving outsiders who don't understand the relationships and history involved. And if the family problems involve serious crime, then families should work together to fix the problems and make sure they don't happen again. I nodded, making more notes. What would fixing the problem look like in this situation? Marcus's face brightened, apparently interpreting my question as willingness to negotiate. We could set up payment plans to pay you back, maybe with interest. We could promise never to use your cards again without permission. We could even give you some kind of collateral to make sure we follow through. And in exchange, you'd call off the credit card companies and tell them it was all a misunderstanding. Maybe say you'd given us permission to use the cards but forgot to mention it to them. So you want me to lie to credit card companies and law enforcement agencies to help you avoid consequences for your crimes. I want you to help your family resolve a problem without destroying everyone's lives over money. The manipulation was expertly crafted. I was being asked to choose between money and family, with the clear implication that choosing justice over relationship harmony made me greedy and disloyal. Marcus, what do you think would happen if I agreed to your plan? Everyone would be happy, the family would stay together, and we'd all learn from this experience and be more careful in the future. And what would happen the next time someone in the family decided they needed something they couldn't afford? He was quiet for a long moment. That wouldn't happen. Why not? Because we'd all learned our lesson. What lesson? To ask permission first. I almost laughed at the simplicity of it. Their takeaway from systematic theft wasn't that stealing was wrong, but that they should have been more polite about it. And if I said no when you asked permission, then we'd respect your decision, just like you respected my right to control my own credit cards. Marcus flushed, realizing he'd walked into a logical trap. That was different. We didn't think you'd mind since you were doing so well and everything we bought was reasonable. So you made assumptions about what I'd want rather than actually asking me. We made family decisions based on family needs. You made criminal decisions based on personal wants. The conversation was going in circles, with Marcus unable to acknowledge that their theft had been wrong regardless of their justifications or intentions. Every argument came back to the same basic premise that family relationships exempted them from normal legal and ethical standards. Look, he said, finally, leaning forward with a more desperate expression, I know you're angry, and you have every right to be. We handled this badly, and we should have been more considerate of your feelings. But sending your own family to jail isn't going to fix anything. It's just going to create more problems for everyone. What problems would it create for me? You'd lose your family, he said simply. Mom and Dad would never forgive you. Vanessa and I would never forgive you. You'd be alone, and for what? Money that you're getting back anyway. The threat was delivered with the matter-of-fact tone of someone stating an obvious truth. If I pursued justice, I'd be choosing money over family and would deserve the isolation that followed. The emotional blackmail was delivered with the confidence of someone who'd used it successfully many times before. You're right about one thing, I said, closing my notebook and standing up. If I pursue criminal charges against people who stole $50,000 from me, some relationships will change permanently. Marcus looked hopeful, apparently thinking I was reconsidering my position. But those relationships changed the moment you decided to steal from me, I continued. You just didn't tell me they'd changed. You kept pretending to love and support me while systematically robbing me blind. His expression shifted from hope to resignation. So that's it? You're really going to send us all to jail? I'm not sending anyone anywhere. The legal system will determine appropriate consequences based on the crimes you committed and the evidence you provided. I'm simply refusing to lie for you or help you avoid accountability. Marcus stood up slowly, shaking his head. I hope you think this is worth it when you're spending holidays alone because you chose money over family. I hope you think stealing from me was worth it when you're explaining to future employers why you have a criminal record. After he left, I sat in the quiet shop for a long time, processing the conversation and its implications. The pattern was becoming clear. They'd moved from denial to justification to negotiation to threats, but they'd never reached acknowledgement or genuine remorse. Every strategy was designed to avoid consequences rather than accept responsibility. The next week unfolded with the methodical precision of legal machinery in motion. Attorney Park filed formal criminal complaints with detailed evidence package. The credit card companies initiated collection proceedings against my family members for the fraudulent charges. Credit reporting agencies updated their files to reflect the documented fraud. My phone rang constantly with calls from family members, extended relatives who'd heard pieces of the story, and family friends trying to mediate the situation. I answered none of them. Every conversation would just be another attempt to convince me that family loyalty should override legal justice, and I'd heard enough variations of that argument to last a lifetime. On Wednesday, I received a certified letter from an attorney representing my parents. The legal language was complex, but the basic message was simple. They were claiming that I'd given them verbal permission to use my credit cards, that the charges were legitimate family expenses, and that my fraud reports were malicious attempts to damage their credit and reputation. Attorney Park reviewed the letter with barely concealed amusement. They're trying to argue that systematic credit card fraud was actually authorized family financial planning, he explained. It's not a strategy I'd recommend, given that they've already admitted on recording that they took the cards without permission. Will this complicate the criminal case? Not at all. If anything, it strengthens our position by showing they're unwilling to take responsibility for their actions. Judges don't look favorably on defendants who blame their victims for reporting crimes. The following Monday brought news that the district attorney's office had decided to pursue felony charges against all 4 family members. The evidence was overwhelming, the financial damages were substantial, and the systematic nature of the fraud indicated clear criminal intent rather than simple mistakes or misunderstandings. I felt no satisfaction when Attorney Park called with the update, just a quiet sense of closure. The legal system was working exactly as it was supposed to work. People who committed crimes were being held accountable for those crimes, regardless of their relationship to their victims. That afternoon, Aunt Helen called with an update of her own. "Your parents called me," she said without preamble. "They wanted me to talk to you about dropping the charges. They seem to think I have some kind of influence over your decision." "What did you tell them?" "I told them that if they'd wanted family input on their financial decisions, they should have asked for it before they started stealing from you, not after they got caught." I could hear the steel in her voice, the same protective instinct that had prompted Uncle Tony to create safeguards for my inheritance. "They're telling people that you've changed," she continued, "that success made you hard and They're painting themselves as victims of your cruel ambition. Are people believing them? Some are. People generally prefer simple stories where someone is clearly good and someone is clearly bad. The idea that loving parents could systematically steal from their successful daughter is more complicated than most people want to deal with." The observation was accurate but not surprising. It was easier to believe that I'd become greedy and vindictive than to accept that trusted family members could be capable of serious financial crimes. 2 weeks later, I was working late at the auto shop when Rosa knocked on my office door. "There's someone here to see you," she said, her voice careful and professional. "She says she's your sister." Vanessa stood in the customer waiting area, looking smaller and more fragile than I'd ever seen her. The tennis bracelet was gone from her wrist, probably sold or surrendered as evidence. Her clothes were rumpled, her usual careful makeup absent, and her eyes were red-rimmed from crying. "Can we talk?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. I gestured for her to follow me back to the office, closing the door behind us for privacy. She sat in the same chair Marcus had occupied weeks earlier, but her posture was completely different. Where he'd been defensive and argumentative, she seemed broken and defeated. "The lawyer says we're probably going to jail," she said without preamble. "Real jail, not just fines or community service. He says the evidence is too strong and the amounts are too large for plea bargaining." I waited for her to continue, not trusting myself to speak without revealing how conflicted I felt seeing her in genuine distress. "I keep thinking about how this all started," she said, staring at her hands. "It was just supposed to be one small purchase, something I needed for work but couldn't afford right away. Mom said you wouldn't mind, that you'd probably offer to help if you knew I needed it." The story was familiar but somehow more believable coming from Vanessa than it had been from Marcus or my parents. She'd always been the follower in our family, the one who went along with other people's plans rather than making her own. "But then it got easier," she continued. "One purchase became two, two became five, and before I knew it, I was planning shopping trips around which of your cards had the lowest balances. It became like a game, seeing what I could buy without triggering any alerts. Did you ever think about stopping?" "Sometimes," she admitted, "especially when I saw how hard you were working at the shop, how proud you were of building something for yourself. But Mom kept saying that successful family members should help struggling ones, that you were being selfish by hoarding resources while your siblings scraped by." The manipulation was exactly what I'd expected. My mother had positioned herself as the ringleader, recruiting her children to participate in systematic theft by convincing them it was justified wealth redistribution rather than criminal fraud. "Vanessa, do you understand that what we did was stealing, regardless of Mom's justifications?" She nodded, tears starting to flow freely. "I understand it now. I understood it then too, but I didn't want to admit it to myself. It was easier to believe Mom's version where we were just sharing family resources." "Why are you here now?" "Because I wanted to apologize," she said, looking directly at me for the first time since she'd arrived. "Not to try to change your mind about the charges, not to ask for forgiveness I don't deserve, just to tell you that I'm sorry for what I did to you." The apology was the first genuine acknowledgement of wrongdoing I'd heard from any family member since this began. No justifications, no excuses, no attempts to minimize the harm or shift responsibility. "I'm also here to tell you that you're doing the right thing," she continued. "I know that might sound weird coming from someone who's probably going to prison because of your decision, but we committed crimes, and crimes should have consequences. If you let us get away with this, we'd just do it again, maybe to you, maybe to someone else." "Do you really believe that?" "I have to believe it," she said simply. "Because if I don't believe that our actions were wrong and deserving of punishment, then I have to believe that you're a terrible person for reporting us. And despite everything that's happened, I know you're not terrible, you're just someone who got tired of being stolen. We sat in silence for several minutes, both processing the weight of her words. This was the conversation I'd wanted to have with my entire family weeks ago. The acknowledgement of wrongdoing and acceptance of consequences that might have changed how I felt about pursuing criminal charges. Will you be okay? I asked finally. Probably not, she said with a sad smile, but I'll be honest, which is more than I've been in a long time. The lawyer thinks I might get a lighter sentence because I'm cooperating and showing genuine remorse, but I'm still looking at probably 2 years in prison and financial obligations I'll never be able to repay. I'm sorry I made choices that led us here, she replied, but I'm not sorry you reported us. Someone needed to draw a line somewhere, and I'm glad it was you. After Vanessa left, I sat in my office for a long time, watching the Denver skyline light up as evening fell across the city. Her visit had brought a sense of closure I hadn't expected, not because it changed the legal situation, but because it confirmed that at least one family member understood the difference between explanation and justification. The criminal cases moved forward with bureaucratic efficiency over the following months. My parents hired expensive attorneys and continued fighting the charges, maintaining their innocence and claiming persecution by an ungrateful daughter. Marcus initially followed their lead but eventually accepted a plea agreement when his public defender explained the likely outcomes of going to trial. Vanessa cooperated fully with the prosecution, providing detailed information about how the scheme had been organized and executed. Her honesty earned her a reduced sentence of 18 months in minimum security prison, plus 5 years of probation and restitution payments that would likely continue for decades. My parents' trial became a minor media sensation when local news outlets picked up the story of successful business owner who'd prosecuted her own family for credit card fraud. The coverage was mostly accurate, but sensationalized, focusing on the family drama rather than the underlying financial crimes. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all counts. My parents were sentenced to 3 years in federal prison, plus restitution and permanent damage to their credit ratings that would affect their financial options for the rest of their lives. Marcus received 2.5 years, plus similar financial penalty. His gaming equipment and other purchases made with my stolen credit were seized and sold to partially offset the restitution amounts, though the proceeds covered less than 10% of what he'd stolen. I attended none of the hearings, trials, or sentencing procedure. Attorney Park represented my interests while I focused on rebuilding my life without the constant stress of family members, who viewed me as a resource to be exploited rather than a person to be respected. The auto shop continued to thrive, expanding into additional services and eventually requiring a move to a larger facility. Rosa was promoted to general manager, overseeing daily operations while I focused on strategic planning and business development. We hired 3 additional mechanics and opened satellite locations in 2 nearby communities. 6 months after the sentences were handed down, I received a letter from Vanessa at the minimum security facility where she was serving her time. She wrote about the job training program she was participating in, the education courses she'd enrolled in, and her plans for rebuilding her life after release. I spend a lot of time thinking about the choices that led me here, she wrote in careful handwriting. Not just the stealing but the years of entitlement and justification that made stealing seem acceptable. I'm learning to take responsibility not just for my actions, but for the thinking patterns that led to those actions. She ended the letter with an observation that stayed with me for weeks afterward. I used to think that family meant never having to face consequences for hurting each other. Now I understand that real family means caring enough about each other to insist on accountability when someone does wrong. I wrote back, a brief note acknowledging her letter and wishing her well in her rehabilitation effort. I didn't offer forgiveness or reconciliation, but I did express hope that she'd use her time productively and emerge as someone capable of healthier relationships. A year later, I ran into Marcus at a grocery store near downtown Denver. He was working as a stock clerk, wearing the kind of uniform that suggested entry-level employment with limited advancement opportunities. His criminal record had eliminated most professional job possibilities, leaving him with the kind of work he'd probably avoided before his arrest. He saw me before I saw him, and for a moment I thought he might try to avoid the encounter entirely. Instead, he approached with the careful politeness of someone who understood that bridges had been permanently burned. "Hello, Natalie," he said simply. "Hello, Mark. I heard the shop is doing really well, expanding into other locations." "It is? That's good. Uncle Tony would be proud." We stood there for a few awkward moments, both apparently unsure how to navigate a conversation between former siblings who'd chosen different sides of a criminal prosecution. "I want you to know," he said finally, "that I understand why you did what you did. I didn't understand it at the time, and I was angry for a long time, but I get it now." "What changed your mind?" "Prison," he said with a wry smile. "Amazing how much clarity you gain when you're living with the actual consequences of your choices instead of just talking about them theoretically." "Are you doing okay?" "I'm doing honest," he replied. "It turns out that's harder than I thought it would be, but it's better than the alternative." After we parted ways, I realized that my family members were becoming the people they'd always had the potential to be. They just had to lose everything first to discover those possibilities. Prison and financial ruin had stripped away the entitlement and justification that had enabled their theft, leaving them to confront the basic question of who they wanted to be when they couldn't take shortcuts or exploit relationships. 2 years after the sentencing, I established a financial literacy program at the community college, focusing on helping people understand credit, debt management, and the legal consequences of financial fraud. The program was funded through the auto shop's profits and administered by volunteers who'd learned these lessons through their own difficult experiences. Vanessa was one of the first program graduates after her release from prison. She'd served her full sentence, completed extensive financial counseling, and found work as administrative assistant at a nonprofit organization. Her wages were modest, but she lived within her means and made regular restitution payments with the diligence of someone who'd learned the true cost of stolen money. We didn't rebuild a sisterly relationship, but we developed a cordial professional connection through the financial literacy program. She occasionally spoke to new participants about the progression from small financial compromises to major criminal charges, sharing her story as a cautionary tale about entitlement and justification. My parents were released after serving 2.5 years of their sentences, but they chose to relocate to another state rather than return to Denver and the community where their crimes had become public knowledge. I heard updates occasionally through extended family members, but they made no attempts to contact me directly. The house in Lakewood was sold to pay legal fees and partial restitution, with the proceeds covering less than 30% of what they owed. They would likely be making payments for the rest of their lives, a permanent reminder of the true cost of their theft. On the 5th anniversary of Uncle Tony's death, I visited his grave with Aunt Helen, bringing flowers and a copy of the community college's financial literacy program brochure. The program had served over 300 participants, helping people understand credit management, recognize financial manipulation, and make ethical decisions about money and relationships. "He would be so proud of what you've built," Aunt Helen said, placing her own flowers beside the headstone. "Not just the business success, but the person you became when tested by people you trusted." I keep thinking about what would have happened if I'd just let it go. I reflect. If I'd chosen family harmony over accountability, "You'd still be getting stolen from," she said simply, "and they'd still be thieves. The only difference would be that none of you would have learned anything from the experience." The auto shop had grown into a small empire by then, employing 15 people across 3 locations, and generating enough profit to fund not just the financial literacy program, but scholarships for community college students and small business loans for entrepreneurs who couldn't access traditional financing. I'd built something that reflected my values rather than my family's expectations, exactly as Uncle Tony had advised in his letter. The business success was satisfying, but the personal growth was transformative. I'd learned the difference between family love and family exploitation, between loyalty and enablement, between forgiveness and accountability. The relationships I'd built in the aftermath of my family's betrayal were healthier and more genuine than anything I'd experienced before. Friends who knew my whole story and respected my choices. Business partners who valued integrity over convenience. Romantic relationships based on mutual respect rather than financial compatibility. Sometimes people asked if I regretted prosecuting my family, if I wished I'd found some middle ground that preserved relationships while addressing the theft. The answer was always the same. I regretted that they'd chosen to steal from me, but I didn't regret choosing justice over dysfunction. They'd taught me that love without boundaries wasn't love at all, just exploitation disguised as affection. They'd shown me that family loyalty was supposed to be mutual, not a one-way obligation that allowed some members to victimize others without consequence. Most importantly, they'd forced me to choose between the person I was and the person I wanted to become. I chose to become someone who couldn't be stolen from, manipulated, or guilt-tripped into accepting abuse from people who claimed to love me. The mountain peaks visible from my office window served as daily reminders of the decision I'd made years earlier. Just like those peaks, some things were worth defending regardless of the cost. regardless of who objected, regardless of the relationships that might be lost in the process. I'd inherited more than money from Uncle Tony. I'd inherited the understanding that real security came from your own character, your own choices, and your own refusal to compromise your values for the convenience of others. When I canceled everything that day, I didn't just cancel credit cards. I canceled the version of myself that had been too loyal, too trusting, and too willing to be victimized by people who confused love with access to resources. The person who emerged from that cancellation was stronger, wiser, and infinitely more capable of building the kind of life that reflected my true values rather than their false expectations. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up, just click and check them out.